graduate of East Carolina University. I graduated in the Maritime Studies program with a focus in underwater archaeology. After leaving in 2016, I went and worked in the private sector at a CRM firm called R. Christopher Goodwin. And then from there, I've spent the last 2 years working at Clemson's Warren Lash Conservation Center as one of the underwater archaeologists. And at the Warren Lash Conservation Center, we primarily work on the H.L. Hunley, which is a Civil War era submarine that sunk off of the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. But beyond just the Hunley, we also have been taking in contracts and looking at other projects. And one of the big ones that we have is a 4,000-year-old dugout canoe that was found about a little over 20 years ago and has been property of the South Carolina, the state. And then the Conservation Center recently took temporary rights for it for conservation purposes. So that's what our presentation is about.
Go ahead, Gyllian.
Yes. Hi, my name is Gyllian Porteous. I'm a coworker of Nick's at the Warren Lash Conservation Center in North Charleston. I'm an archaeological conservator. I graduated from the Queen's University Masters of Art Conservation program in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. My specialization is in archaeological conservation, and I've worked with a number of different types of artifacts and materials, primarily either Mediterranean, Canadian Arctic, and now South Carolina Maritime. So I worked on the Hunley among some other projects, and the canoe has been a very fun change from primarily looking at iron conservation to now looking at wood conservation.
Awesome.
Hi everyone, I'm Nathan Richards. I'm a professor in the Department of History, and I'm also the director of the program of Maritime Studies at East Carolina University. I've been here since 2003. Actually, for a short while, I was also a program head at the UNC Coastal Studies Institute in a joint position between the Department of History and basically a coastal lab on Roanoke Island. And actually, that's sort of what I'm presenting on today, is in that role in the Coastal Studies Institute. I sort of ended up in a sort of a liaison position where a lot of people would contact us about things happening in the northeastern part of North Carolina, and I would correspond with the underwater archaeology branch, and I would end up working on a diverse array of different things, and in this case, a small collection of waterlogged timbers from Currituck Sound.
Awesome. Bethany?
Hi, so I'm Bethany Earley. I am currently finishing up my very last semester of graduate school for the Maritime Studies master's degree. Thesis is successfully defended, and it was the focus of Barbour Boatworks. Which is where this research really stems from. I came into the program with a background in history and English, so it was really interesting to be able to take a more archaeological and anthropological perspective on the Barbour Boatworks company and looking at their advertisements, which is what this presentation was about. So excited to share that with you all.
Awesome, awesome, thank you. I forgot to mention earlier, we are recording this session for posterity, and we'll be posting it on our YouTube channel for people to view once this conference is over. So I'm just going to sort of summarize. I think all three of the talks in this session were really awesome. And it was kind of interesting to see the sort of scope of time periods covered exemplified in your three talks, ranging from sort of the pre-contact Native American, period to the more historic early antebellum, and then moving in to more modern times. And it was interesting to see you talk about the different types of boats that were built, and how the earlier two were more special built, more utilitarian boats, and as you get into more modern, as society progresses into more modern times, you get these recreational pleasure sailing craft. as advertised by the Barbour Boatworks. And so I thought that was an interesting scope of topics, and I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more about them. But to begin, for Nick, Gyllian, and Nathan, we sort of have two instances here where we have artifacts that are sort of being rescued after being pulled from their original context. One in the form of the canoe, and other the 18 Waterlily timbers. And Gyllian, I thought you made a great point about disassociation as an agent of deterioration when an object is removed from its original context or cultural relationship, that results in a loss of the intrinsic value of an object. So can any three of you sort of discuss how to manage that as you progress with analysis, conservation, collaboration with the public, and how some of that intrinsic value can be recovered through the archaeology or conservation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think ours specifically has a really interesting kind of connection with what you're talking about with intrinsic value. And I'll let Gyllian kind of talk a little bit more about the specifics of how we're doing that to kind of bring that back to its original kind of form that way. And ours is kind of a sadly classic tale of rescue archaeology. You know, in the presentation, I talked briefly about how the canoe was originally recovered by an individual who did it illegally. And then not only was you have that disassociation from its original context, but in the archaeological sense as well, we never actually found where it was originally located. So that was lost as well. So we only have a fragment of an already, you know, small canoe, you know, that's been deteriorating over time. So we only have a fragment of those fragments. And then Gyllian, if you want to talk a little bit more about how we're trying to bring that back with our outreach program with the canoe specifically.
Absolutely. So in a case where we can't add to the history of the canoe by actually looking for where it was, you know, where it was originally lost, where it was buried or sunk, not being able to add to it by finding any other contextual artifacts and or other pieces of it, then another way we can approach it is looking to the community that would have constructed the canoe. And this was a major focus of my master's program. We were really trained to always consider the culture that created the object, the originating culture, and how important that culture is to the intrinsic and intangible value of all artifacts and cultural materials. So it was just kind of a natural step then to realize that we needed to do collaboration with the Native American communities in South Carolina. Obviously, the canoe is extremely old, so approximately 4,000 years old based on carbon dating. So we can't, you know, definitively say it comes from one tribal group over another. And on top of that, obviously, since European contact started so early in South Carolina, the tribal groups and organizations are nothing like they once were at the time of contact, so let alone what they once were 4,000 years ago. So our approach to dealing with this has just been to involve everyone that we can, anyone who's interested. The thought being that we can have this great collaborative relationship, this exchange of information and knowledge, where we can come to the communities in South Carolina and say, look, we have this. It was something that would have been made by your ancestors. Come see it. Tell us if you can glean any knowledge from it that would be valuable to you. If you can share with us any information about, you know, how canoes are important to your culture, both to your ancestors' culture and also to you now. It just adds a whole nother element to a project that otherwise would almost be dead in the water, in that we don't have any context to it. So it's been a really cool project, and it's also it's just very rewarding, I think, to work with members of the community, since, you know, we're doing all this work for a reason. There's a reason why we conserve archaeological materials. It's because we want to conserve them for people to enjoy. So it's great having that option. So we're adding to the story of the canoe, but also giving, like, kind of enriching the project in the time at the same time.
Right.
The intrinsic value part of the Waterlily story is a difficult one because anyone who lives on the Outer Banks sees the reports of timbers showing up in some way or another constantly, every nor'easter, in particular, a nor'easter or a hurricane, multiple reports. So, the idea that we're going to be able to conserve water lily-like timbers or other various shipwreck timbers is very difficult for the state to manage. So taking possession of the water lily timbers was an interesting scenario. It's like, it's an interesting analog with the case of your canoe, because it's interesting that we keep talking about unnamed people. The people that are in my case, the discoverer, thought that I think he thought he was giving the timbers to his neighbor so that she could perch her decoys on it. I don't know if he anticipated that it would become a subject of archaeological study. And at that point, he didn't really want to be identified. So the degree to which you are able to engage with him as a part of the story becomes problematic, and also becomes a little bit problematic because we could just, my work there is very much an interim report because we are missing context, but we could rediscover it. There's probably a wreck to go and find, and there's probably more pieces to add to the puzzle. But it's definitely a bit of a conundrum on how to move forward with that. My hope is that there's a maritime museum being built right now up in Karatuk, and that perhaps if the conservation treatment works, that they can take possession, and then hopefully we've added to that historical context. And by doing that, we're contributing back to the community where, frankly, there wouldn't have been any contribution other than taking timbers to the dump.
Right. So sort of building off that, all of you have mentioned, working with the public, whether it be with the tribal communities, and also public possibilities for public display or education outreach opportunities. And Nathan, you mentioned hopefully, going to this museum in Karatuk. So how do you think these artifacts, these features, could be used for public interpretation? Are there plans for that? And how could the research be benefit from engagement with the public? And Bethany, feel free to chime in as well. I don't know, is there any Barbour boats still out there that you're aware of? And do they have any sort of, is the boatworks still operational, or?
So the Barbour Boatworks is a little different from both of the other two in this section because the Boatworks is gone and there are boats still available. Most of them, however, are privately owned. So there's a Facebook group, which is currently the biggest way that the information is getting out there. The person who runs that, he's working to try to get a registry of all of the available boats. And a lot of the emphasis with that is not on conservation, it's just on plain reconstruction. And you can see that a lot of the vessels are being refurbished and they look beautiful, but you then do lose the original context of, is this really what they initially built? And a lot of it can be determined whether that is true or not, because there were those technical specifications that the Barbour Boatworks advertised, which then meant that you could have a better idea of how to reconstruct them in the closest way. The Maritime Museum down in Beaufort also has a couple, but those are the only publicly owned ones that I am aware of. The History Palace, the History Museum at Tyrone Palace has done a little bit of work, partially because they're currently sitting on the location of the previous boatworks, but on the whole, there's public outreach, but it's really difficult because part of it is advertising these boats because you can still buy them.
Right.
So it's a little tricky.
So for the canoe, is there any plans, you know, as part of the conservation plan? And I know, and maybe you can talk about how long. I know peg treatment usually takes a decent amount of time, so we got plenty of time to think about it. But I mean, in your initial talks with the tribal communities, you know, is there talk of public display, either at one of their locations or within a museum?
Well, so we're in an interesting spot at the lab because we don't have, you know, quote unquote ownership of the canoe. We have temporary rights to it for conservation purposes. So it's an interesting part of our outreach program is, you know, we're trying to involve the community and as much as we can, but at the end of the day, like that say that we have nothing to do with that. So that'll be up to, you know, once the conservation is done, it kind of goes back to the state for those kind of decisions. I think we'll probably be included in some talks about, you know, where it goes, and on our end, we'll try to be cognizant of how, you know, the community feels in terms of where it goes. But, you know, as of right now, that's kind of beyond our scope or our ability because of, you know, ownership purposes. And then, you know, and Gyllian can talk more about, you know, the specifics of time, which is also an issue with the conservation.
So yeah, so like Nick said, we don't really have control over where it goes, and so it's we're certainly going to encourage the community to discuss with the state, and hopefully there can be some sort of like kind of mutual agreement reached. But in the interim, what we are going to work on is we obviously do really want to publicize the treatment of this canoe, and the community also is invested in that. The Native American communities in South Carolina are largely invisible to public life. Like the average person frequently doesn't seem to be even aware that Native Americans still exist in the state. That certainly came up when we first discussed consulting with Indigenous communities in South Carolina. Some of our coworkers were a little confused as to they were still there. So obviously the communities are keenly aware of this, and they want to raise the public awareness of their communities, especially since only one of the tribal groups is federally recognized. We have a few state recognized, but rights as the tribal group really increase once you're federally recognized. So there's this real investment in wanting to make the public aware of these communities and their continued existence and their thriving culture as it continues into the modern age. And to that point, there has been some talk about communities being interested in trying to do a reconstruction and potentially even paddling of the reconstructed canoe, potentially down the same river, the Cooper River, where it was, because we do know at least the river, Long River. So yeah, so the community itself is really interested in doing more public outreach, and we'll do what we can to support them. And we're planning on doing a blog to follow the project. Again, however, we're trying to wait on making any concrete plans until we are able to have the first consultation event where we can get confirmation from the various groups that want to participate, what they're comfortable with being made public, or how much involvement they want to take in that public engagement.
Is something that that I know, and again, this is all very preliminary because you're waiting on those, you know, sort of meetings with everybody. But is something like a digital, a 3D you know, modeling? Because I know that y'all do that extensively at the Hunley Lab. So is that something that is sort of on the table for this, and maybe to help, I don't know if it would help inform any other reconstruction efforts, or, you know, you would have it, you know, if they did it in the traditional method, you know, to reconstruct it, then you could also have the digital option. I don't know if that's something that's being discussed or.
Absolutely, it's definitely in our plan, is to do digital reconstruction of the fragments as they are, use that to possibly inform the experimental archaeology in the reconstruction. And then, I mean, we can do all sorts of things, especially with, you know, everybody kind of knows the digital documentation of 3D objects is so much faster than it used to be. And we have a couple of things, that we have at the lab for that, with structured light scanning as well as photogrammetry, which is, pretty standard across the board for archaeology. So we have lots of things that we can do. I mean, it would be great to do, just a digital reconstruction of what we have, and then compare that with the reconstruction, and then also try to use what we have to possibly recreate digitally what it may have been. So we have those options, and those are all things that we're planning on doing from the archaeological side. So,
right. That's a nice segue into you, Nathan. In terms of digital reconstruction, do you think that that's something that would help with, in public interpretation? Is that something that, as you going through the analysis, obviously that, once you learn, you're going to learn more, but could that help inform any sort of public outreach opportunities?
Yeah, that's a great question. With the case of the Waterlily timbers, it wasn't just a rescue project, it was an unfunded rescue project. We don't have any funds. The underwater archaeology branch didn't want the timbers to go into private ownership because they are under general statute and the Abandoned Shipwreck Act property of the state. So they saw some benefit in the educational benefit coming to ECU, and also implied in this experimental conservation idea that Dr. Rogers at the time had pitched was the chance that the conservation program could be catastrophically bad for the timbers, right? It could ultimately damage them. So, I mean, within the context of what you then do for public outreach, because, have you captured the information but otherwise ruined them for public display, or have you captured the information and then it can go into public display? So we're in the situation where hopefully the timbers are stable and that we can begin the process of having meetings to see who would like to have them. And then it would be more a matter of, now where's the funding going to come from to do something, whether it's some static display or something maybe innovative from a digital or virtual standpoint. Because the challenge with Waterlily is I've got 18 timbers from something that had way more than 18 timbers.
Right.
So, and frankly, the idea of reconstructing a wooden vessel for me personally is something really new and that I'm trying to learn. So I'm not sure whether it's possible. I'm going to give it a go and hopefully, use the appropriate words to say proposed, interpretive, and not be very certain about things. But I would hope that what we could do is organize someone in Karatuk, taking into account that the Waterlily timbers have been given the state number CKS 009. So they're the 9th shipwreck reported in Karatuk Sound. There's not a wealth of information on shipwrecks in the region. So every time something like this shows up, the people that I'm in contact with are keenly aware and very interested. But there's a few practical things to take into account, like homes and long-term storage, and then funding.
Right. Well, it's interesting with Waterlily shipwreck, because it's so often we find a wreck that is just kind of appears to be just a work boat, that it's not like a named vessel that is well known, is very well documented. And so all we have is the archaeological features, such like the burn marks on that one plank, and the possible construction types. So what are you finding that we can learn from these timbers and to contribute to a knowledge base for boats that were considered not important?
Yeah, that's so interesting, because it is just right now the Waterlily timbers CKS 009. It's completely not something the public is going to get really excited about. It doesn't have a story. So, it's always the case, really, it's the case of any maritime archaeologist who does work, is to connect those tangible remains to the history, and then to consider all the different layers of significance, right? So I think that that's the other reason I'm being careful in saying that this is an interim report, because we really don't know, where this thing is in the context of many things, from a technological point of view or a historical point of view. even from a construction features point of view. So we're still trying to discover that. But my hope is always that we would make little discoveries and then culminate in something that is easier to support. Is to get the public support, to then build the momentum, to find the funds to display them well. So I've got all kinds of hopes. I just don't know if they're going to culminate in something. So we'll see. We'll see how many more interim reports I have to write.
Nathan, I have a question for you, because yours is an interesting one in the terms of it's kind of like ours. It's highly fragmented. And North Carolina has such a rich maritime history with, such a vast array of small fragmented vessels that we've found compared to high profile ones like Queen Anne Revenge and things like that. With something this fragmented, how's the public response to it in terms of interest and excitement? Because I know as archaeologists, we find timbers and we get really excited to try and, extrapolate as much information off of such little data. But in terms of public outreach and interest, I mean, where does that kind of lay with a shipwreck like this that is just a set of timbers with not a lot of associated information?
Yeah, so when we first were sort of made aware of these and took possession and started to do the work, and you'll remember this because you were actually the photographic model for our press release. So
True.
I was at the Coastal Studies Institute, and of course we wanted to constantly publicize. It was a new program, and everyone in the Outer Banks is really interested in maritime heritage. So every time we had an opportunity to do some press, we did it. And so at that point in time, there was the odd sort of interaction or correspondence message of support sort of thing, but invariably the next shipwreck shows up, the next nor'easter comes through, the next story, the next wreck emerges from the beach, and those vessels often have the names and the histories associated with them. And I think people sort of forget. And I think the Waterlily timbers are forgettable until research conveys them in some sense that they're not so forgettable anymore. And so, I think that answers your question.
No, absolutely, it does. And then, because that kind of makes, same with what we're dealing with, because especially at the lab, we have, this extremely high profile wreck with the Hunley, and then we also try to garner interest with a fragmented canoe that to a group of people, so the Indigenous people and then us as the researchers, we get excited, but to compare that excitement with the higher profile stuff. And then with yours too, in terms of funding, does that change as you have high interest right at first, and then it's easier to get funding when people are interested, and then all of a sudden a new shipwreck shows up and then that kind of dissipates? Have you kind of run into that in terms of searching for funding?
Yeah, we haven't actually searched for any funding for Waterlily. It's been a back burner project. Part of the reason for that is because the conservation treatment that Dr. Rogers set up was going to take so long as well, and right. So, and then we were trying to cobble together the sort of in-kind support and enlist grad students and build public programs to try and extract as much public benefit from the timbers as possible. So I'm not sure how that might change in the future. I'm hoping that the conservation treatment concludes pretty soon, and that then with something written, with some information put on paper and with reports made to the underwater archaeology branch, that then I can start reaching out to people I know in Currituck County and say, this is what we know. Is this of interest to you? Because the current agreement is that the timbers will always stay as property of North Carolina, people of North Carolina, but we could still hold on to them. Like the Maritime program could still, in the agreement, hold on to them as a teaching tool. We do have some artifacts that are property of North Carolina, but we hold them under agreements. So in that sense, we'll wait and see, right? There may be no interest, in which case these stay teaching tools forever.
Right, and you bring up a really interesting point with the conservation and how long it takes. And I know that we're going to run into that with the canoe, where we're going to garner a bunch of big interest right at first, and then have to remind people that the conservation process takes a long time. You know, it's a marathon, not a sprint in terms of this, you know, public engagement. And I think that's a tough thing to kind of get across sometimes when you're dealing with public outreach, is that understanding of how long this stuff actually takes, and to try and keep that interest up throughout the process. So that's definitely something that we're going to be facing.
Yeah, especially with wet wood treatments, because one, they take a very long time. The more degraded, the longer they take, right, for the impregnation with the polyethylene glycol. But then on top of that, the goal is no change. And no change is exciting to no one. Like, it's like you get everyone excited, and then 2 years later, you're like, it's done, look. And everyone's like, it looks the same. And you're like, you're right, it does. Aren't we the best? Like, and people are like, no, I don't. Why do we care? Because it didn't change.
Right.
Good.
Just show them a shriveled piece of wood that is not from you, but
yeah, it's why I included in the presentation images of it, because that's always what we need to do. It's like, it could be terrible, and people are like, okay, but no, it really could be horrible. It could be terrible.
Of course, that was the other thing that I encountered on the Outer Banks, is that there's often an assumption, and I think it's as much archaeologists not communicating this, is that there's no secret shipwreck fund. There's no like shipwreck fund for conservation that just, hey, you've got some old timbers, give it to someone who may be connected to the state in some way, and the next thing it's in a vat of polyethylene glycol forever. It doesn't work that way. So the downside of doing press for Waterlily is often that the next person finds the next stinking piece of wood that's pulled out of the out of the ocean, and wants to give it to you. And assuming that that's what's happened with Waterlily, perhaps, or some other wreck, or they know that these things exist. And the next thing, and this actually happened in one case, a person who had a timber, it looked like Waterlily, came out of the ocean. They wrapped it in cling wrap, you know, left it out in the backyard for 3 weeks, and then put it in the back of their truck, and then sort of threw it at me and said, "Here you go. Here's your next one." And it's like, no, I can't take that. It's not mine. Plus, you know, it's really far gone now. You know, it's been baking it's been sort of stewing in your backyard wrapped in cellophane. So, you know, it creates all these sometimes these other problems.
Yeah, I would definitely say that archaeologists need to probably do a better job of kind of engaging with the public and letting them know how this process really works in terms of time and the amount of funding that it takes for the less exciting part of the process. And I think we've all heard, you know, tales of this happening all the time, where all of a sudden the state or whomever is kind of funding something, you know, kind of gets the bill for the conservation and how much that's going to cost, and they're like, you know, maybe not. And I'm hoping that with our project, with the level of transparency that we're attempting to create with the blog that Gyllian mentioned, that we can kind of get that side of the archaeological process out there to the public, in terms of time and what it actually takes. And maybe, you know, with that kind of effort, it could, you know, slow people or stop people from doing what you said, where they, you know, pack up a bunch of shipwreck timbers and then bring them to you, and rather just tell you about locations to leave them in situ.
It's all about marketing the archaeological process. Right. And with that, I'm going to segue into a study that focused on marketing strategies. And Bethany, in your presentation, something I noticed was that the Barbour Boatworks collection, the utility and the vacationer model seem to be the most consistently built across the time period that you were looking at. And then you had at the end, you had the Silver Clipper come in, and they start making it a bunch. What do you think made those two, the utility and the vacationer, so versatile over the years? Whereas like they would do one or two other models and it would fall off, one or two other models and it would fall off. Like were there sales dropped, or is there any other indication you get from the advertisements? Oh, I think your sound went out, Bethany.
Here.
There you go. You're
Okay,
good.
we're good?
Good.
Okay, cool. So I don't think that there's really much in the advertisements that explain why the utility and the vacationer were that reliably produced. For the fact that the vacationer had been produced for 28 years by the end of their production. And I think part of it is that was their boat. It was the Barbour utility and the Barbour vacationer. And those were the two that they thought were both affordable enough for a variety of customer ranges, versatile so that it could go enough places that there would be that interest, but then also it was just who they were as not exactly a brand, but that was what they could produce that they thought enough people would care about. And I think the other vessels that really went on and off, those were what the hip new thing was. And the hip new thing only really gets sold because it's hip, and once it goes out of style, there are other things that fit that marketing gap.
Do you think that that's why towards the end of their recreational building sort of period that they decided to go for less types and more customization of a single type in the Silver Clipper?
I think definitely. Another thing with the Silver Clipper is they really like that bow shape. That came after or right around the time when Herbert Barbour died, and he had done the majority of the designing for the earlier vessels. So part of the reason for the wide range of early vessels could have been that's what Herbert Barbour liked. And then they found something afterwards that was good and reliable. And yes, people could customize for what they want and not have to put a big strain on advertising all of the different changes, which is another part of the reason that I think people would have liked the Silver Clipper and part of the reason that they got rid of so many of the different earlier models.
Right. I think, Nathan, you got a question for Bethany.
Yeah, so when we were planning this conference, we were trying to divide everything into sessions, and you're never quite sure how it's going to all fit. But we use this term for vernacular, and vernacular is, I guess, something that's sort of debated the way it can relate to watercraft. But thinking about Nick and Gyllian and the canoe and its context within its environment, and even with Waterlily, there's this idea that perhaps it's people are building these boats and they're adapting somehow to the environment they're working in. And so my question for you, Bethany, is Barbour Boatworks has a company and is building recreational watercraft and has a perception of its market. Do you think that that part of its perception for its market was people who wanted to operate their watercraft in the special circumstances of North Carolina, or were they adapting the boat's design to other places in the United States?
So part of the difficult thing is that I think that Herbert Barbour had the history of working in New Bern in North Carolina itself. So I would not be surprised if North Carolina was really the main focus of what they saw for their boats. However, I believe they had dealers in all 50 states, and they also sold a lot internationally. So I think there was a versatility to their design that allowed it to be operated in a lot of different locations. In their advertisements, they did note that yes, it could be used for both freshwater and saltwater. So they were willing to see that adaptation, but part of that could have been for within North Carolina itself. But I think they also did have that broader view of the all-around boat that could be used anywhere by anyone. And that's how they advertised. They advertised nationally, and the advertisements that they had for local in North Carolina were pretty similar to everything else that they had placed out. So I don't see it as being specifically that. I see them trying to invest in their community. They did try to garner that goodwill, and I think that they weren't blind to the requirements of boat building in North Carolina, but I don't think that was their sole focus.
Awesome. I'll open up to, is there anybody else have any question that they would like to ask from the gallery? No? Okay. I'll, oh, Chelsea.
I had put one in the chat for Bethany as well, but I was interested as whether you compared advertisements for these boats for this particular company to like other companies or other types of products that were being marketed at the time. I'm just kind of interested in whether like the marketing strategy was like similar to other types of things that were happening in that field in the 50s and 60s.
So if you look at the advertisements that were particularly placed in Motorboating magazine, you can see stylistically they're very similar. A lot of the companies will focus on similar features, similar materials that are being used, and aesthetically the pictures used, there are standard shots and they're pretty reliable. There was one company, the Bertram Yacht Company, Navtech division, and they had a slightly different advertisement strategy for special interest magazines. And they really focused on giving a lot of the technical information. So you don't see a lot of that technical information being used by the Barbour Boatworks Company or a lot of others. But because the Barbour Boatworks also had those sales brochures, and they really emphasized that you could request them and you could see all of those technical specifications along with the more standard and flashy action shots and the verbal descriptions. I think there are similarities in that, but there really wasn't much that was overly distinct either for Barbour or for a lot of the other companies that I saw. There was another company that was, I don't have the exact date for this, but their logo was Thompson Better Built Boats, and Barbour Boatworks has pretty famously been Barbour Builds Better Boats. So there's a lot of similarities across all of them. And the one distinction that I found because I was studying the Barbour Boatworks was really their sales brochures. And it's likely other companies had those, but they just aren't as obvious and evident to find.
Bethany, do you think that there are any other like record groups or archival material within the collection that could help sort of talk about these particular boats? Or and I know you had mentioned that there are some boats themselves still out there. Are you aware of any other material that could help sort of further shed light on this time period for the boatworks?
For the boatworks itself, the archives at the East Carolina University, I believe the Maritime Museum down in Beaufort does have a few documents. They actually have some of the few remaining lines drawings that were available, because once they stopped building the vessels, they destroyed their lines drawings. So it's potential that some of their archives could be useful. And then also it's just finding people and talking to them to see if they remember the boats. I know that Herbert Barbour's granddaughter is still alive. She wrote an article on the boatworks, and I believe there's still people around who have that memory. And I think if you could get them to help share the history, that would be particularly beneficial. Some newspaper articles are also useful, but again, you have to find those really small local ones and dig through it. So I think those are probably the biggest areas that still need further research in order to fully understand the history.
Right. And it's interesting because the sort of oral history, I mean, I would imagine that there are a decent amount of people that were probably like a kid when their parents took them out on one of those boats or something. And it's also, interesting in y'all's talk, Nick and Gyllian, when you had, the parallels, showing it's not an oral history, it's a living history. of them making the canoe, and it's nice to see that sort of those two, the archaeology and the living history, come together, and that's something that would be interesting to see for Barbour Boat Works. I have another question for Nathan, and for your reconstruction analysis, do you have any plans to potentially model parallel boats? You had mentioned a few, one of which was mentioned earlier, the Mepkin Abbey wreck, the Browns Ferry vessel. As you mentioned all those in your talk as being possible parallels, is there a plan in your reconstruction analysis to model those and compare Waterlily to those?
I hadn't planned on modeling the 13 case studies that I'd found, mainly because of the time invested in that. But I have been spending a lot of time trying to look at the drawings that have been done. And actually the drawings have been the best source of, right now we have such a loose chronological idea of how old these timbers are. And we don't have any absolute dates. There hasn't been any dendro results. There hasn't been anything else. So really the comparison of the nautical, of the architecture is the best thing. So, it would be a great idea to do that. I think the other part of this is that my research has been deficient in Virginia. So I've got, I think partly because Ski has done so much great work in documenting, and I can easily find those reports and publications on Mepkin Abbey and B&B and these other sites, but I don't have a good handle on other potential analogs in Virginia and north of North Carolina. I do have one recent case study that I just found in Maryland. So I still have too many questions about what I'm comparing to and what's reasonable to compare to. But it does seem, just from the dimensions, that the skier data is the best comparison right now.
Right. I'm running out of ammo to throw at you guys. Is there anybody else? I'll open the floor again. Does anyone have a question for our presenters?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I think that's a very productive approach that Nathan used with combining the South Carolina data sets. And although there's a limited amount of chronological information, there might be some provenience information for some of those sites, at least in terms of their locations in proximity to well-known plantation sites, and possibilities of affiliations with either industries, rice industry, or particularly planter families or ethnic enclaves. But they can be very tenuous links, but they may be, there may be something there, at least to build some sort of narrative around it. I know we spoke about doing that with, tweaking more out of a story for World War II ships or Native American canoes. So, to think innovatively about how to, what could we possibly, stories could we tell to engage the public? But by combining North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia information, because I think you have the Clydesdale vessel in Georgia, and then a Pecorelli vessel, which was interesting because he found some unique features that suggested it was plantation built. So I don't know, Jim, if you could, if you had any, have you guys done anything more in Skier, to look at any more of those types of, possibly vernacular vessels that were not built in shipyards, and
No, not really. Pretty much, all the wrecks that were mentioned in Nathan's talk are, pretty much, that's the final product really at this point in time. So yeah, no, we haven't really looked at too many parallels. But if you need any information, or you don't have hands on some, Nathan, give us a holler and I'll send it to you. Yeah, I was thinking that the Maryland wreck, was that Nansemond River wreck that was found during that compliance project?
I can't. It starts with an M. I've only just found it, so I apologize. It's the Marshanak wreck or something. I found an avocational report on it, and I've only just found it. So yeah, I don't know much about it. The Nansemond will be one I'll look up though. So thanks for that.
Yeah, that was that should be newspapers, or I don't know which research firm or which contractor firm found it, but it was during a bridge crossing, and they identified it and seemed like it was a smaller coastal type vessel that probably fit along the lines of the Malcolm boat and perhaps the Browns Ferry. Although Browns Ferry is probably a lot earlier than yours, just based on the fact they use so many natural looking timbers. But weren't you positing that you may have had like what the king plank or whatever, king keel or something like that versus a true keel?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, the thicker bottom plank as the keel. Yeah.
Okay. Well then, yeah, Browns Ferry would be that parallel for that, having that type of king plank keel.
Yeah. Of course, the other part of the Waterlily, we could go back and try and find other pieces. And I guess in the back of my mind, though, there's the problem that the reconstruction I've attempted, because I don't really think it's a real attempt, because we've only just finished doing the 3D modeling of the individual timbers. I've sort of tried to model something based on the midship section, but if the oral history of the discoverer is true, then he said it was the bow. So I'm still trying to reconcile that information. And as much as this was a back burner project, and I normally study other things, so it's always a matter of trying to work out how much time I'm going to commit to it, is do we want to go back and clear up those little mysteries? Are we going to find more diagnostic traits of bow timbers? And then that would help us with this reconstructing these 18 timbers. The fact that we've got an entire plank, it was, I think, a pretty important find in the context of the whole assemblage, but there's just so many questions. And actually I should say that the other thing is the historical context for me just isn't really clear. I guess that's the great thing about the South Carolina data, between all of the theses and your reports, SKIA, and actually Dr. Harris's book, Patroons and Periagas. The context is so rich, and so I'm really hoping that we could move towards that. And I've only really delved into the land deed records right now to sort of get some inklings of what's happening in the sound. But there's a bias, at least from my limited research, that's late 19th century maritime history in that sound is really well documented, but before it becomes really, really kind of fragmented. So I need help, and of course COVID's not helping that. So I want to go up to the Currituck libraries, and I've got some contacts up there with much deeper knowledge than I have.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see, whoever, when the landowner pulled up those timbers from the wreck. I forget if the person mentioned anything about like pulling it up the keel or what have you, or if what was pulled up was only what was sort of sticking up out of the water. So like you're saying, if there is more, if there was that many timbers there and there was a whole plank and everything like that, there might be a lot more structural material to help, and it'd be interesting to go back out, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I can only assume and make a whole range of assumptions. Like if he's got a big obstruction, then he's going to reduce the hull from the top part down, right? So, the top side, the upper parts of the wreck probably went first, and he might even have a keel sitting there if it's not in the way of his boat ramp. Then he's probably going to leave it there. He's not going to put the effort into removing that. And frankly, it's probably beneficial for him to have a somewhat planked bottom if he's pulling his boat in. So I really don't know, and we'd like to maybe go back, run a side scan, see what's there. But of course, the other part of the story is that he said that the bow washed in. I don't really know to the degree to which that's true, but maybe it's a fragment of a wreck that broke up some other place and washed in. So maybe it's CKS 009 isn't right there. Maybe it's some other place. Who knows?
Archaeology is always fascinating. Working with so little material. But with that, I mean, it pretty much brings us to the hour. I want to thank all of our presenters for coming here, and thank you everyone for sticking around and listening to us talk. It's worth noting that the graduate student paper prize will be announced at the end of the next session. I believe, and Chelsea mentioned earlier that she is looking for content for the tributaries. So if you have an interest in publishing either your talk today or some other topic related to the maritime history of the Carolinas, please reach out to Chelsea. So with that, thank you everybody. It's been wonderful. The next session will start at 12:15, I believe. It'll be historic landscapes of North Carolina.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.